Hi, my name's Paul Sargent. Welcome once again to AP Euro Bit by Bit, the series in which I'm trying to break down modern European history into small bite-sized pieces so that you can better understand it. Today, the much awaited, much anticipated, and slightly overdue results of the Age of Imperialism. Let's start the intro. All right, so if you saw my last video on how imperialism got started, you have the idea of what caused these European countries to go out and colonize Africa and Asia. And really, they were very successful and colonized most of both of those areas of the world. Today, we're going to take a look at a much more complicated question. And that's what the results are of the Age of Imperialism. And as with everything else in history, there is a mix. There are good results and bad results. And in this case, some questionable results. So let's start with the conquerors. Well, the European nations had both good and bad results of the Age of Imperialism. Let's start with the good things. On the pro side, the economies of these countries were booming, with trade moving around through the colonies, areas with new markets, new raw materials available. They were able to create new things. It drove innovation. It drove investment, and it drove financial power for things like the Bank of England and English entrepreneurs and German entrepreneurs and Spanish entrepreneurs, maybe not quite as much, certainly a little few Portuguese entrepreneurs. You get the idea. Lots of entrepreneurs. And they were able to get a lot of real wealth out of this whole system at the expense of those people that they colonized, obviously. It also gave them the ability to put ports and supply stations around the world, especially when it comes to the British, to support the large navy which was being used to move materials from one area of the world to another. And then, in a more lasting sense, they gained things from the cultures of the people that they colonized. Whether it's food, whether it's art, whether it's ideas, whether it's new ways of looking at the world, there were definitely things that they got from these civilizations that they wouldn't have gotten had they never come into contact with them. And that's important to understand because it makes the people in Europe start to question the sort of overwhelming sense of progress that had exuded from Europe, well, ever since really the Renaissance. And it's going to catapult itself into more anxiety, more uncertainty after World War I. The other thing it meant is power. European countries were able to hone their military power at the expense of the people, unfortunately, who they colonized. But they did it with relatively little resistance, and they did it relatively easily, meanwhile making themselves ever stronger and ever more ready for what would eventually be a very large war. But what about the negative side? This is what is less talked about. For the Europeans, certainly there's a loss of life in a lot of these things. People died in putting down rebellions. People died in conquering areas. Deaths, absolutely nothing along the scale of those people who were colonized. But perhaps most importantly, on the negative side for Europe, these colonies created new opportunities for conflict between the major European powers. These boundaries they created in the Berlin Conference were not based on a whole lot of knowledge of the people who lived in the area. They were based purely on dividing things up evenly. And so, when those arbitrary boundaries were put down, there were conflicts. And those conflicts made things more difficult diplomatically in Europe, which would eventually lead to, World War I. Well, the colonized are kind of the flip story of the colonizers. There are far more negatives for them than positives. So let's start with the negatives. The negatives of colonization are an immense loss of life, loss of culture, loss of identity, loss of language, loss of so much that these cultures had developed over the course of thousands of years. And so you have a complete and utter loss of the traditional way of doing things, and it's replaced by a system which is just sort of set down on top of it by European colonizers. Those people who were colonized had little chance for advancement. They had little real opportunity inside of the colonies. They could go along with the colonizers and maybe make their life a little bit better, but they never would be quite equal with the colonizers. This is especially true in British India, which already had a caste system set up when the British got there, and the British kind of just set themselves right at the top of the caste system, so that there was this already understanding, I guess, that people could only move so high. On the other side, you could only move so low within your own life because you were part of a caste, but you could never be British. And that was sort of a ceiling that was really keeping a lot of people down. The exploitation of labor was a real problem. Labor was used freely by the colonizers to build all kinds of things, to mine things, to create raw materials. And finally, there's just the negative of being on the losing side of a power struggle. The lasting effects of that, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Okay, but first we also have to acknowledge that there are positive things that come out of colonization for those that have been colonized. Mostly it has to do with infrastructure, because European countries agree that when they go in, they're not just going to set up trading posts like the Portuguese did during the period of the Age of Discovery, but they're going to actually settle these colonies and they're going to improve these colonies. So they build bridges, they build roads, they build factories, they build all kinds of things. They create cities, which are going to make the people's standard of living generally better. Cleaner water, more access to more products. Obviously, you could say there's a negative to that, but generally speaking, standard of living is going to tend to go up. There's also the idea of education, and many of the educated elite who will end up leading revolutions and independence movements throughout Africa and Asia, which will be successful after World War II, many of them, if not most of them, were educated in schools in the colonizing home country. In other words, the upper class colonized peoples would send their children to the home country to be educated so that they could come back and be a more effective part of that colony. So really the big pro for those areas that are colonized is a more modern society. You could argue that that's a negative, but it's a tough one. Now, just to finish up, the hardest part about all this is the legacy. Because since colonization, since the Age of Imperialism, Africa, to a great extent, and Asia to a slightly lesser extent, has been embroiled in turmoil. There are certainly arguments to be made that this is a direct result of the Age of Imperialism. And there are also arguments to be made that it's the result of the independence movements and the people who have taken over those independence movements and the governments that were created after them that have sown the seeds of all of these civil wars and famines and everything else. But regardless, in the long term, you have a real net benefit for the colonizers, a more diverse society, a more prosperous and wealthy society, and you have a worse situation for the colonized peoples who now live in countries with arbitrarily drawn boundaries that have competing groups of people within it that are embattled by civil war, economic turmoil, dictatorships, and low standards of living. Is this a result of imperialism? Well, these are the sorts of things that historians like to argue. So there you have it. Those are the basic results of the Age of Imperialism. So I hope you learned something here. Hope you enjoyed watching it. As always, my name's Paul Sargent, and this is AP Euro Bit by Bit. Please spread the word. Tell people about this. Let them join in on the learning. It's wonderful to expand your horizons. So with that thought in mind, thanks for watching. Have a great day.